A narrow inlet cuts into the limestone coast of Crimea and curls like a question mark toward the land. From the open Black Sea, you cannot see the harbor at all. Steep hills guard the water. Wind is muted. Sound carries strangely. Locals called it a bay. Sailors knew it was a hiding place. This is Balaklava. If you walk the modern quayside on a quiet winter morning, gulls circle over the water. Cafes open late. But if you keep going to the curve at the end of the inlet, rock and concrete swallow the path. A steel door sits where a cliff face should be. Beyond it, a tunnel cuts straight into the mountain. Cold air, the smell of damp limestone, and the echo of water against a wall you cannot yet see. The door is an entrance to a place that once did not exist. During the Second World War, this coast was a front line. In 1941 and 1942, the German 11th Army and the Luftwaffe besieged Sevastopol just a few miles away, battering the port and its defenses with huge artillery and concentrated air power. The Black Sea Fleet stayed in the fight, ferrying men and guns, evacuating when it could. But it paid for that persistence with burned quays, shattered workshops, and ships torn open in harbor. The lesson was blunt. A navy that shows itself can be targeted. A navy that can vanish may survive. After the war ended, the possibility of the next one arrived quickly. In the 1950s, planners in Moscow considered what a nuclear war would actually do to ports, to runways, to surface fleets. They looked at maps of the Black Sea and asked if there was anywhere a submarine could hide, truly hide, and still sortie to the deep. When the finger traced the coast to Balaklava, it stopped. The inlet was narrow. The surrounding ridge, Mount Tavros, was thick limestone, old and hard. From the sea, the bay was invisible. From the air, it could be camouflaged. From the viewpoint of an adversary, it was a blind spot. The decision followed. Cut the mountain open and put the Navy inside. Construction began in the 1950s and ran into the early 1960s. The facility would be known by a number and a code. Object 825 GTS, Hydraulic Structure Number 825. It would look to outsiders like raw stone and scrub. Inside, it would be a harbor, a dockyard, and a shelter designed to withstand a direct nuclear strike of the kind planners feared most in that decade. The claim that Joseph Stalin personally ordered this project has been repeated in travel guides and popular articles. Contested. Archival proof remains thin. Stalin died in 1953. And most of the construction belongs to the era that followed. What is not in dispute is the logic shaped by the war he had led. Shelter matters, surprise matters, and the Black Sea Fleet needed both. Workers arrived under special construction units, guarded and sworn to secrecy. They drilled and blasted 120,000 tons of rock from Tavros, moving much of it at night by barge so daylight would not betray the scale of their work. The tunnels were carved in long curves and straight lines, their shapes matching the forms of vessels that would glide along them. The main internal channel was roughly 600 meters long, a concealed canal, high enough to echo, deep enough to float a submarine without touching keel to limestone, and wide enough to pass with a meter to spare along the walls. Secondary tunnels branched off to workshops and storerooms. A dry dock sat like a stone cradle in the dark. Every entrance and exit was a problem to be solved twice. Structurally, so the sea pressure and the mountain's weight would not collapse them, and visually, so reconnaissance aircraft and, later, satellites would see only rock and water. Camouflage nets darkened the openings. Caisson gates, the kind of doors a shipyard uses to hold back an ocean, could seal the harbor from fire and blast. At full war configuration, the entire complex was meant to be closed, lights down, engines quiet, air filtered and recirculated, with people moving through decontamination corridors between sections. Object 825 GTS was built to support diesel-electric submarines of the Black Sea Fleet, what NATO would call Whiskey and later Romeo-class boats, Soviet projects 613 and 633. Diesel boats need air when they surface or snorkel, fuel they can carry only in limited amounts, and careful maintenance to stay silent and reliable. Balaklava could do all of that under a mountain. Boats entered submerged from the seaward portal, rose to periscope depth in the tunnel, and then surfaced completely inside the hill unseen. Crew stepped onto concrete under electric lights. Tools and spare parts were not on a windy pier or a lit-up city wharf. They were a few meters down a passage, in a shop where the floor always stayed the same temperature. Numbers tell part of the story. In normal conditions, the main channel could berth several submarines nose to stern. In crisis conditions, the entire labyrinth could harbor more than a dozen boats. The water in the tunnels ran deep enough, around 8 meters, to allow work on hulls from the side and below. The tunnel widths varied between about a dozen and just over 20 meters, with the ceiling arching above to leave space for cranes, catwalks, and cranes again. You cannot build submarines without lifting something heavy. There was also a separate, sealed section with the blandest possible title, the Repair and Technical Base. Its task, storage, assembly, and maintenance of naval weapons, including, in later years, nuclear items for the submarines that would carry them. Contested. Some guides call this Object 820. Other records and museum labels refer to Object 280. The details of layout and designation differ in the public sources. The existence of a dedicated hardened weapons section is well attested. The rule on such confusion is simple. The more secret the place, the more aliases it tends to accumulate. In daily use, life inside Balaklava was prosaic. A submarine would creep in from the Black Sea, a duty officer would whisper orders that echoed twice, and then the whole space would fill with the smells of diesel fuel and paint. Mechanics took off boots and put on softer shoes so footsteps would not carry. Welders sparked in the dry dock. Torpedoes moved on rails under covers. An engineer wrote a date on a chalkboard, pressure test, pump change, battery inspection, then wiped it off with his sleeve. You can still sense the rhythm in the museum today, the way narrow corridors widen suddenly where a crane once needed to turn, the glow of lamps on stone, the cabin-like rooms where crews sat at metal tables. Secrecy wrapped the outside as tightly as concrete wrapped the inside. In official documents, Balaklava became a district of Sevastopol. Maps left the submarine yard unmentioned. The town's civil life bent around a silent military center. Newcomers were screened. Mail was read. Photographs of fishing boats were, sometimes, not a good idea. Sailors who served here recall what any submariner remembers: weeks passing slowly in routine, followed by minutes when every action must be perfect. In the Cold War, concealment is a weapon, but so is simple geography. Balaklava's strength was the notch it cut into the land. If a submarine cleared the inner doors and hugged the mountain shadow, it could reach deep water faster than planes could be scrambled from adversary bases 1,000 kilometers away. If the harbor were struck, the ridge itself would absorb heat and shock better than any concrete cover. In theory, and this is an important distinction, a design theory tested by calculations and trials rather than by war, the facility would survive a nuclear blast of the smaller battlefield yields imagined in the 1950s. Doors would ripple, generators would thrum, and the crews would wait in filtered air for the command to move. What about the Second World War, whose ghost seems to stand just outside every scene? The link is not a straight line in dates. It is a straight line in logic. Sevastopol's experience in 1941–42 proved that surface infrastructure on this coast could be broken by sustained air attack and heavy guns. It also proved that submarines, small, numerous, and stubborn, were hard to kill. Balaklava took those lessons and poured them into limestone. The project belongs to the Cold War in time, but to the Second War in memory. Soviet naval doctrine in the Black Sea was pragmatic. Diesel boats could lay mines, shadow convoys, deliver reconnaissance teams to remote coasts, and, if conflict expanded into nuclear exchange, provide a retaliatory threat that could not be preempted as easily as a bomber runway could. Rumor travels fast in ports. Sailors in Odessa, Constanza, and Varna traded stories in bars about a base under a mountain where submarines slid like ghosts. Officially, it did not exist. Unofficially, the existence of such a place does its own quiet work in a rival's mind. There is an unusual footnote in the Balaklava story: trained marine mammals. The Black Sea Fleet ran programs with dolphins and other species for underwater patrols and object marking. Balaklava's geography made it a practical training area. The work was sometimes mundane and sometimes exotic, but it reinforced an essential point about the base. This was a place where many different parts of a concealed naval system could be brought together without going into the open. Daily operations were measured in checklists and voices. Battery charge complete. Intake valve 3 tested. Gyro aligned. The big drama was silence. Sailors speak of the way the sound changes inside the tunnels when a boat's hull displaces more water. The pitch drops. You did not need to see the submarine to know it was undoing its lines. You could hear it in the walls. No military facility stays at its peak forever. As technology shifted, new classes of submarines, new weapons, new sensors, the balance of value changed. In the early 1990s, the Soviet Union broke apart. The Black Sea Fleet was divided and disputed. Units departed or were reassigned. Balaklava's gates opened not for a mission, but for a future in which it no longer had a mission. Some equipment was removed in an orderly way. Other metal vanished the old-fashioned way, by theft and salvage when guards and funding were thin. What had been a secret harbor became, briefly, an abandoned cave laced with rails and oil stains. Then the doors swung again, this time to tourists and school groups. The facility was reorganized as a naval museum, still cold, still echoing, but lined now with displays instead of torpedo cradles. Guides walk people through the dry dock and explain how a caisson gate works. In one chamber, a Whiskey-class submarine sits moored, its hull matching the tunnel the way a hand fits a glove. The spaces are intact enough that you can follow a boat's path with your feet. Entrance from the sea, slow glide along stone, stop at the dock, roll weapons into the forward room, then out through the mountain again. A few facts draw particular attention, and it is worth setting them out clearly. First, the chronology. The base's conception belongs to the post-war nuclear era, not to 1943 or 1944. Construction spans the 1950s to the early 1960s. The idea that it was already operating in the early 1940s is incorrect. The argument that wartime experience inspired it is persuasive. The claim that wartime engineers were already digging here then does not hold up in the public record. Second, the Stalin's order question. Many popular narratives attribute the project directly to Stalin. Contested. Documents that would settle the matter precisely are scarce in open archives. It is plausible that strategists under his leadership explored hardened basing concepts before 1953. Most work certainly occurred after his death. The safer phrasing is that the base reflects the security logic of the Stalin-era and the build-out capacity of the years that followed. Third, weapons storage designations. Visitors and articles mention Object 820 as a nuclear storage site associated with Balaklava. Others cite Object 280. Contested. Both numbers appear in guide materials and secondary sources. Archival precision about which code covered which room varies. What matters for history is that a hardened, sealed section existed for weapons handling within the complex. Fourth, what it could withstand. The design specification often cited is resistance to a low-yield nuclear strike. Figures in the tens to around 100 kilotons appear in technical summaries and museum labels for the resistance category. That is not a guarantee. It is a design criterion. Engineers tested blast doors and structures. The base never faced a live nuclear detonation. As Balaklava's story turned from secret to exhibit, the Black Sea did not become quieter. The Crimean Peninsula remained a place where military forces watched one another closely. In recent years, media reports have suggested renewed military interest in the facility. Those are contemporary developments. They sit outside this film's main time frame. What matters to our purpose is the historical arc, a hidden harbor conceived in the shadow of the Second World War and built for a kind of war that never came. It is tempting to end with an image of a submarine sliding through the mountain at dawn. But the most meaningful image is smaller. A wrench in a mechanic's hand, a chalk mark against a gray wall, a door wheel turned slowly to seal a room. Object 825 GTS did not depend on one grand secret. It depended on thousands of small certainties, on the ability to service, refuel, and arm submarines without anyone outside seeing a single movement. In military history, success is often an absence. A convoy that is not attacked. A base that is not discovered. A weapon that is never used because its existence is enough. By that measure, Balaklava did its work. For decades, it hid. It provided the fleet with shelter and the state with options. It turned a mountain into a naval instrument. Walk the tunnels today, and the air feels steady at around 15 degrees Celsius. The rock drips in the same spots it always did. The water taps against the same concrete sills. The guides talk about batteries and bulkheads, about torpedo rails and filters, about a dolphin program and a sealed weapons room. They point down the long straight line where a submarine would have moored, and say, simply, here. If you listen long enough, the echo brings back the shape of a hull that isn't there. The acoustics remember. Our story began with a hidden bay on a coast made famous by sieges. It passes through a war where surface strength was burned apart, and into a Cold War where survival meant becoming invisible. The underwater fortress under Mount Tavros was not a myth. It was stone and steel and labor. It was also a response to lessons learned at terrible cost only a decade earlier. You cannot see Balaklava from the open sea. That is the point. A navy that learned the price of being visible built a harbor that could vanish, then taught its crews to move inside the mountain as if it were just another part of the ocean. The base's power lay not in a dramatic launch or a famous battle, but in the quiet knowledge that while the world looked elsewhere, the Black Sea Fleet could still open a steel door, turn on running lights, and slip away into deep water.